All right, so as we move along, let's read this parable today. You can follow along with me if you would like. Luke 18, 9 to 14, whatever translation you have. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus said, "I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Now, a very short, pithy parable to the point, but also one in which we need to again examine the background, particularly of the Pharisee and the tax collector, to understand what Jesus is doing here. The background of this parable, as all parables are, as we've talked about, was applicable to real life. Again, this is not an academic dissertation. This is not something that Jesus did that the people were not familiar with. But in the temple courts, there were 4 times a day for prayer, as noted in your handout. And so this would have been something that Jesus drew from everyday life in terms of the familiarity of the audience he's talking to, and having these 2 individuals be the example for the parable. Now, a little bit later, we're going to talk about how Jesus reverses what would commonly be understood here, as he did, as we shared last week in the parable of the Good Samaritan, how he reverses the standards of that time. But I want us to first delve a little bit deeper into who the Pharisees were and how we understand these 4 major groups. It's always a fine line between getting into some of the details here and then going down a rabbit hole, which takes us away from our main focus and main point. So I'm going to try to finesse that a little bit here today. So there was 4 major groups, or sects, S-E-C-T-S, in the time of Jesus. Okay? Now, these would change over time. And again, the roles of these individuals also change. Remember that both before, during, and after the time of Jesus, there was a lot of flux going on in terms of who the particular political leaders were for the Jewish people. So for some, depending on what century you're talking about, we're talking about the Seleucid Empire. For some, it's the Hasmonean dynasty after the revolt of the Jewish people. And then later on, you're going to have the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and of course the whole role of Rome and the Hellenization of what would take place amongst the Jewish culture. And that plays into the influence that these 4 groups have. Now, we've all heard of some of these terms, but who really were these people? And I was asked a question before class, which was a really good question. Are there any modern day successors to the Pharisees? Which actually there has been a Jewish rabbi who's answered that question, and I'll give that to you today. So the one that we're obviously most concerned about today, that we've probably heard the most about, are the Pharisees. And then you have the Sadducees, you have the Essenes, and lastly, the Zealots. Now, for our purposes, and again, we're not going to go down too much of the rabbit hole here today, but just to give you a little background, after 70 AD, in effect, these 2 groups are wiped out and no more, along with the Sadducees. And the reason for that is, of course, when the temple is destroyed, it has a major impact. The Essenes were a group that was disgruntled with all of the other 3 of these groups. And we know from our studies here in various classes that you may have encountered that the Essenes were the basis of a very ascetic, monk-like group that lived out in the desert, and also the setting for the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. So the Essenes, which possibly John the Baptist had been a part of as well, and his heritage were not happy with any of these three other groups that took place. The Zealots advocated the violent overthrow of the occupiers, the Roman empires. So the Zealots were the advocates for violence. Jesus had to deal with the Zealots, and while there's really no proof for this, there is some belief that Judas Iscariot may have been a part of the Zealot group advocating the violent overthrow, which was one of the reasons perhaps that he was led to betray Jesus. We don't really have proof of this at all, but certainly that violent group that wanting to overthrow Rome by force. And we know, of course, Jesus, along with Paul, never looked to Rome, never looked to the government for solutions. He was always about something very different. He did not look to that or to political leaders for solutions. So with that after 70 AD, these three groups kind of disappear. Now, who were the Sadducees? The Sadducees tended to be very wealthy, aristocratic, the upper crust of the Jewish society. They were focused more on the priestly caste, the priestly group, and the duties of the temple. Along with the Pharisees, the Sadducees made up the Jewish equivalent in Jesus' day of the Jewish Supreme Court, which was, of course, the Jewish Sanhedrin, that you may have also heard about during the gospel accounts of our Lord's last day. The difference with the Sadducees is that they did represent that upper crust, and they were part of that priestly group concerned with duties in the temple. Now, the other thing about the Sadducees that distinguished them from the Pharisees were more the blue-collar group, okay? Probably in Jesus' time, about 4,000 individuals that were Sadducees. All men, of course, because that was the way it was in that day. But they were part of that. But the other thing is that they were more influenced by the Hellenistic or Greek influence, and they accepted that into the Jewish culture more than the Pharisees did. Okay, so they were fine with, some of the ways of the world that the Greco-Roman influence introduced into that, whereas many other Jews, including the Pharisees, saw that as heresy and saw that as something that could not be done. The other major influence, now remember, I'm vastly summarizing here, and again, not trying to go down the rabbit hole, so this is very broad strokes. But the other major difference with the Sadducees was that they did believe in they did not believe in the afterlife. Okay, they did not believe in a concept of a Jewish afterlife. Why was this? Because for the Sadducees, what was most important was the written law of Moses. And this was most important. And because this was not expressly, brought forth in the written law, they did not believe in that afterlife. For the Pharisees, again, more the blue collar, okay, more the average person, okay. So if the Pharisees said something, the average Jew would tend to believe it and tend to follow it. They would be concerned, of course, they were the scribes and the interpreters of the law. Now, while some of the Pharisees may have had priestly duties or been associated with the priests by far, that role was the Sadducees in terms of the life of the temple. And we can see why these disappear, okay, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, because the temple's gone, so their duties are gone and that whole role, okay? The Essenes disappear because the last Essene community is probably extinguished in the last of the wars, probably around 73 AD. Again, there's argument and debate about this, but roughly around the same time, and the same with the Zealots. So, but with the Pharisees, the other important thing is they believe, in addition to the written law, the oral law, and so therefore they will believe in the afterlife, because the oral tradition of the Jewish law, which is later codified in the Talmud, okay, has that, along with the heritage of the scribes and the interpreters of the law, that belief. Now, how best can I describe this? This is not an exact analogy, but as best I can do. We all see things from our own perspective. So you will have some people claim, and again, we all see it from our own perspective, that there are those who are literal, strict constructionists of Scripture and literal, strict constructionists, for example, of the U.S. Constitution. And then others who will talk about, in addition to the letter of the law, the spirit of the law. Now, the funny thing is, even if you're a strict constructionist, you're still interpreting it according to your own perspective. So that's just reality. Because again, I'm teaching you this class today from my own perspective. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but this is why we have all these debates and why there's been all these breakups both within Judaism and Christianity amongst many different groups and many different denominations in Christianity, because people agree and disagree. But if you would have to make a general argument for this, for the Pharisees, it would be more of a oral and written tradition, so a little bit of a looser interpretation of the Mosaic law versus the strict constructionists of the written law in terms of the Sadducees. Pharisees numbered probably around 6,000, so slightly more than that. And we have evidence outside of Scripture for all four of these groups, which comes from our friend Josephus, of course, the great historian who mentions them. And his first mention of the Pharisees comes after the revolt of Judas Maccabeus around 150, 160 BC, 170, somewhere in there, depending on your viewpoint of that in terms of the various debates. But we have this to take place. So Judaism is not a monolith. Judaism has many different beliefs, many different interpretations, much as Christianity does. It's not saying a Jew is like this or a Christian is like this. Many different beliefs. Now today, of course, we know Judaism is primarily broken up amongst the Orthodox, the Reform. You have the Sephardic Jews, depending on what part of the world you're talking about, who will all interpret things in various ways. But one thing that I think is very important to note is the question about are there Pharisees today is, of course, people will answer that in one of two ways. One is some people will say, well, you have people who are, in light of the parable today, self-righteous, more concerned with their own holiness than they are with humility, and those are the modern day Pharisees, which you can take that and paint that amongst any religious group, Christians included. Those that are more concerned with their own holiness and righteousness than being humble before God. However, there is a Jewish rabbi who has said all Jews today, including all rabbis, are descendants of the Pharisees. Because what happened over time is the role of the Pharisees fell to the rabbis. Why was that? Well, it's like anything else. You get attached a label that you don't like, and because the word Pharisees means separate ones, or separated ones. We don't know if that meant separate from Gentiles or separate from other irreligious Jews or Jews that did not live up to their standards. But when you get a moniker that means, oh, I'm a separate one, you're probably not going to be too well liked at the party, right? So over time, after the fall of the destruction of the temple, and we don't really know over the centuries when exactly this happened, it probably happened over a period of time, that term began to disappear and the role of the rabbi emerged. So in Judaism today, the rabbi, of course, male or female, depending on what branch of Judaism, is the interpreter of the Jewish law and the religious law. Unlike Christianity, which in many Christian organizations and denominations sometimes have a centralized authority. So, for example, there are some Lutheran denominations that are centralized. There are Methodists, Episcopalians, so forth. All synagogues are separate. Now, they may ascribe to a loose confederation of like Orthodox synagogues or Reform synagogues, but they exist as independent entities. And the rabbi is hired as the employee of the synagogue by a group of lay people who lead that local synagogue. Now, you can't hire a Reformed rabbi in an Orthodox church or vice versa, so there are some guidelines and rules there. But they really don't have a centralized organization today, much as many Christian denominations do. So to answer the question, are there Pharisees today? Depends on how you want to answer it. Technically, no one's going to say, I'm a Pharisee. No one wants that moniker, just like Doubting Thomas, right, who got a bad rap, Doubting Thomas, yes, he doubted, but Thomas was the one who said to Jesus, the only one, let us go up to Jerusalem that we may die with you. And he got a bad rap with that moniker, all right? So the reality is we don't use the term today, but the rabbis are those modern descendants, the interpreters of the law. Okay, so hopefully that helps you a little bit with what we're going to look at today. And I know you may have questions, but I want to move on with the parable itself. So let's look at our handout. As I've already said, they were known to their strict adherence to the Jewish law, their commitment to religious purity. Here's some details. Adherence to the law, meticulous observance of the Torah, which included both the written law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and the oral traditions that developed around it. Again, that later comes about through the Jewish Talmud. So again, we have the oral and the written. That distinguishes them from the Sadducees, who rely only upon the written law. They believed in the importance of interpreting and applying the law in a detailed and comprehensive manner. Belief in the resurrection. Again, not shared by all the Jewish groups of the time, was their belief in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in an afterlife where the righteous would be rewarded and the wicked would face judgment. Separation from Gentiles. The Pharisees emphasized the importance of maintaining ritual purity, which involved avoiding contact with things or with people that were considered ritually unclean. This led to a certain level of separation from Gentiles, non-Jews, and those they considered sinners. So remember again, and here's one misnomer that we need to correct. Actually, the Pharisees enjoyed a good deal of support from the common Jew. Unlike the Sadducees, who were considered the nose lifters and the wealthy and the elitists, they enjoyed a good backing of support. We also know Paul, formerly known as Saul, was himself a Pharisee. There are some scholars who argue with very little scholarly evidence, in my opinion, that Jesus himself was a Pharisee. However, this whole negative connotation of Pharisees that we've developed as followers of Jesus Christ, of course, coming with his conflict with the Pharisees, was not commonly held at that time. So again, perspective changes over times. For the Jews of Jesus' day, the Pharisees were generally popular. Now, you're always going to have the grumblings and the, those are the Pharisees, those are the Sadducees, certain level of dissatisfaction that people had. But the reality is that would take place. And again, after that key date of 70 AD, when of all the major Second Temple groups, it is only the Pharisees who survive. And gradually over time, their role is assumed by the rabbi. Now, once your temple is destroyed, once your temple is destroyed and that's taken place, so then what happens? Well, you have these various Jewish groups that gather in small gatherings and in small groups, And of course, they're scattered over wide areas, not just in Jerusalem, but they're scattered all over, And they would be called in Hebrew, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right, but Beit Knesset, which means house of assembly, which, if you know the highest legislative body in Israel today, is called what? The Knesset. So that is the political assembly for the Jewish people today. But in the ancient world, the synagogue, the Greek word, which would come about for the Jewish gathering, which we still have today, synagogue, came from the Beit Knesset. So this is the gathering of Jews that would take place. And of course, the interpreters and the leaders would be seen as the rabbi. Now, there's a man named Chaim Maccoby who speculates that Jesus himself was a Pharisee. And the reason for his argument is that Jesus' arguments with the Pharisees was a sign of inclusion rather than fundamental conflict, because disputation among the religious scholars and scribes and leaders was always employed in the Jewish faith as a form of a search of truth. In other words, answering questions with questions, respectfully disagreeing, even vehemently disagreeing. This was a search for truth, and his argument is it was not necessarily a sign of opposition for Jesus to be disputing the Pharisees rather that he himself may have been a Pharisee. Now, he's an outlier, and most people don't agree with him, but the reality is that that's one perspective of what takes place. And that just shows you the complexity of the Jewish religion, not only in Jesus' time, but still in our day. So, ritual purity. Let's go back to our outline number 4. Synagogue influence. The Pharisees had a significant influence in local synagogues, where they often served as leaders and teachers. This is why later they are replaced with the term rabbi. Places of worship and study that played a crucial role in the life of Jewish communities. Remember, they just didn't worship in the temple. This was spread all over the land, so they worshiped in various areas. Interpretation of the law. Pharisees were known for their interpretive approach to the law, seeking to apply it to various aspects of daily life. They believed in the importance of traditions passed down orally alongside the written law. Obviously, Jesus criticized them. This began debates that would take place. And these debates were largely around issues of hypocrisy, legalism, and the lack of genuine compassion. It's important to note that while the Pharisees had their distinctive beliefs and practices, they were not a monolithic group, and there was diversity among them. The New Testament provides a particular perspective on the Pharisees, and historical sources outside the biblical text contribute to our understanding of this group, which is what I've tried to do here in the early part of this class. All right, we'll move on to the tax collector next, but any quick questions before we move on? I only got time for 1 or 2. Yes?
Some of my Jewish friends tell me that they believe in the Messiah, but he's never to come. What do that come from?
That I can't tell you historically, but of course all the Jews are waiting for the Messiah today. Now the question of who the Messiah is varies widely among Jews themselves today. In fact, there is a rabbi, and Pastor Wallace knows this because we had this discussion, Rabbi Schneerson, who was believed to be the Messiah, and he's long dead, so I guess that kind of rules him out. But the reality is that this is a great debate today. So again, it depends on who you're talking to and who you're discussing to. My only commentary on this, because I'm not an expert on Judaism, my only commentary on this is when you go back and you look at Isaiah and you look at Jeremiah and you look at Isaiah talking about the suffering servant and you look about the description of who the Messiah would be, how can you not say it was Jesus in terms of who he was? That's obviously my commentary on that. But, obviously for the Jews of today, they still believe the Messiah is to come. Good question. One more and then I need to move on if there is any. Yes?
How did you become a Pharisee?
There was particular training that had to take place. Interestingly enough, in the commentary about the wealth of the Sadducees and that the Pharisees were blue collar, this is actually a matter of debate amongst biblical and religious scholars as well. Because, for example, we know Paul, also known as Saul, came from probably a very wealthy family and had to have that religious training because they had to be literate. And in the time of Jesus and before that, many times the only people that had access to that formal training were people who had the means to do it. Now, interestingly enough, the the Pharisees were perceived by the common folk as, again, the more blue collar, but they were still educated, probably more highly educated than their followers. And yet, interestingly enough, the Sadducees were seen as the nose lifters and the others. But there's some evidence that the Pharisees themselves in their training had to have some means to be able to have that formalized religious education. Good question. We need to move on to the next part if we're going to get through this parable. So the tax collector. In the ancient world, there were 3 taxes. So for those of you grumbling about April 15th, this is nothing new. All right. First of all, there was a poll tax simply for the privilege of existing, simply for the privilege of living on earth. Second of all, a land tax, which was 1/10 of the produce of the ground, either in cash or in kind. And third, an income tax, 1% of income. But the real opportunity for taxation, and again, a lot of this comes from the Hellenization and the Roman occupation, obviously, of Judea and the imposition by the Roman government, okay? But the real opportunity was in customs duties, because there were import and export taxes on everything that came in and out of the particular province or country. So, for example, you would have not only a tax for entering a town or a market or a harbor, but the local tax person could demand that men and women unbundle whatever they were carrying. Oh, you have in your bundle an apple and some bread. Oh, we're going to tax that. Okay. You have in your bundle some sticks. We're going to tax that. Okay. So whatever it would be, that could take place. There would be a tax on the cart that people may have being pulled, on the wheel of the cart itself, and on the animal pulling it. And if a poor person could not pay the tax, then what the tax collector would do would say, oh, that's okay, I'll front you the money at an exorbitant rate of interest, 25, 30, 50% usury, and that then you can pay me back over time, obviously, at the rate of interest that was out of bounds. Tacitus once noted in his writing A Rarity, a monument in Judea to an honest tax collector. Okay? Generally, these Jews had sold their souls to Rome. So remember again, we have a situation that's in flux. Some Jews got along with their occupiers, and like the Sadducees who went along to get along, they made comfort with the enemy. Others were like, no way, I'm not going to do this, okay? So, these tax collectors were particularly hated for numerous reasons. One, they were seen as being in consort with Rome. Number two, they were dishonest and would cheat people. And number three, even if they didn't loan the person the money that couldn't pay, they were still taxing people at an exorbitant rate, which of course the tax collector themselves didn't have much control over, because the empire did that, but the reality is they were the ones that were employed by the Roman Empire, so they had agreed to do the job, and that was their boss. So that's just the reality. Now, why is this important in this parable? Because if you remember, last week in the parable, we had the good guys and the good ladies and the bad guys and the bad ladies, that they were reversed, right? So you had the holy Levites, you had the holy priests who were the bad people, and you had the hated Samaritan half-breed who's lifted up as the good person. So what is Jesus doing in this parable? He's doing the same thing. Okay, he's doing the same thing. He is reversing the standards of this world. And this is why it's very important for us to see today as Christians, as the old comment is, you marry the spirit of the age, you become a widow or a widower in the next. So when we align ourselves with the kingdoms of this world, when we align ourselves with worldly things, and what's going on here, and this is what Jesus is getting at, he's reversing the standards. So, in Jesus' day, tax collectors were individuals responsible for collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman government. And here are some key characteristics and aspects associated with tax collectors during that time. Collaboration with Rome. They were Jews who collaborated with the Roman authorities. Of course, the most famous example is Jesus plucks who to be his disciple? Matthew, the tax collector. Okay, so their fellow Jews considered them traitors because they worked for the occupying force. Corruption and extortion, known for their corrupt practices. They have the authority to collect taxes, were often accused of overcharging citizens and pocketing the excess for personal gain. This made them very unpopular. So not only might they gate the interest, not only would they do multiple taxes, but they oftentimes would just make up their own minds and say, oh, Rome's charging you this percentage, I'm going to charge you XYZ. This is really what it is, and then they'd pocket the difference. Social outcasts. Due to their collaboration with the Romans and their reputation for corruption, tax collectors were socially ostracized. They were considered sinners and often excluded from religious and social activities. Wealth and materialism. Despite their social status, tax collectors could become quite wealthy through their collections. However, their wealth obviously came at the expense of exploiting their fellow citizens. Of course, we all know the little ditty and the song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, if we grew up in the church. In the Bible, there's a story about a tax collector named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector who became curious about Jesus. When Jesus visited his home, Zacchaeus repented and promised to repay anyone he has cheated. So, what is important here is to understand what Jesus is doing, and now we kind of get into the parable itself. We've given you the background of all these things and the background of obviously the major players in the parable. But what is Jesus driving home about our faith and our spiritual life? Number one is there needs to be humility coming before God. Now, Jesus would probably, no doubt, say that, initially, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, they all were very humble before God. Maybe even the Zealots, he would not agree with the violence, but they would all say that in some way, originally that was their intention. But over time, what has happened is, of course, this has become corrupt. And so the status, the recognition, the popularity, and the money and material wealth became more important than others. So as we've often discussed, and we've made this clear in many of the classes we've taught here, there was an obligation in the Jewish community to take care of the least of these, particularly widows and orphans. And in that time, due to poor health, poor hygiene, war, and many other things, disease, famine, all these things, many times women would be widowed at a young age and be reliant upon the community because they could not go out and get a job and work to support their family. So unless they remarried, they were out of luck. So this was one of the chief obligations of the religious leaders, to take care of these individuals, but they did not do that and became more concerned with their own adherence to the law. Jesus was not against the law in and of itself. He was against elevating the law over the needs of the common person. And again, this is where he comes into conflict. And I think this was mentioned in last week's class, but Jesus healing on the Sabbath. To Jesus, the need to heal the person was the most important thing. It wasn't the rule about the Sabbath. Whereas the Pharisees would have come in from the angle, and also the Sadducees, that the most important thing was observing the ritual. So let the guy die. Don't heal him. Let him suffer. It was more important to observe the letter of the law. And so to this day, we still, I believe, have remnants in all major religions in the world of these central issues. We have many people, and some within the Christian faith, that believe their own righteousness or the righteousness of their group or whatever is more important, or imposing what they see as right, than humility before God. And so this is what Jesus is driving at here. The humility is so important. Now, one thing we note here, when it says in the scripture, God be merciful to me, a sinner, when the tax collector is saying this, actually, in the Greek, it says, God be merciful to me, the sinner, as if he was the worst sinner in the world. And this is important because, again, it gets to the perspective and the viewpoint here of understanding what is going on. So you have this, this Pharisee who is supposed to be the person who's concerned with the holiness, who's supposed to be the person concerned with, making sure that you're following God. And he's in there just, oh God, I am the greatest person. Thank God I'm not like these other people. And, sadly, we still have remnants of that today. Even in our little sayings, there but for the grace of God go I. In a way, that's a comment like, well, thank God I'm not like that person. Thank God I don't have it as bad as that person. And Jesus is driving at here, we need to see with each other our common humanity and the needs that everyone has in terms of this situation. Two things are needed in faith. And this is what, again, Jesus is driving at here. So overall, you have the sense of humility, okay, that's important. But also in here, there's some other things. It's our own sense of being inadequate and depending upon God. So there's a dependence upon God. And this is what the Pharisees lost, along with many others, because they believed they had it all buttoned up. They believed they had it all taken care of, you know. If they just did it the way it should be done, the way I tell you to do it, then that should be the way it is. Dependence upon God. And then secondly is a sense of our own sin, and therefore what's important in that. And what I mean by sin is sin with a capital S, the fractured relationship with God. You may have noticed that in Christianity, as we've come along in the years, that, you know, many things that we once considered a sin we've kind of discounted, right? So for many years, things like gambling, we went through a period of prohibition in this country where drinking all alcohol was outlawed. That was seen as a sin. Even divorce, okay? Because, 80, 100 years ago, if you got divorced, you were kicked out of Christian churches, okay? And you were outcasts. So some of our perspective on these things have changed over time. So each culture, each generation, and again, agree, disagree, whatever your particular stance on these things, but what doesn't change is sin is our fractured relationship. It's the way we are before God. It's the original sin of Adam and Eve. It's our desire to be like God. And really what this Pharisee was doing is he wanted to be like God. Oh, thank God, I'm not like that other person. Oh yeah, I'm a great person. And so he's praying for show. He's praying for show. And he's praying to impress other people. And that's obviously not what prayer is about. I want to talk about that in just a moment in the relationship to prayer. Even Paul himself, Paul is a very complex person. When I meet Paul someday in heaven, I have a lot of questions for him. But we see a progression in Paul because in 1 Corinthians he says, I'm an apostle to the Ephesians. And there's various times where Paul says, I'm an apostle, and he boldly stakes his claim because Paul has a bit of an inferiority complex to the 12 and to others because he wants to be sure he's seen in the same light. Of course, coming out of his background, who can blame him because he has a lot of work to do to convince people he is truly a follower of Jesus Christ when he's been murdering Christians and so forth. But then he goes on to say, I am the chief of all sinners. I am the worst of all sinners. I am the absolute worst. In terms of this situation. I am the least of all the apostles. I am the least among all these. So Paul kind of in his writings makes this progression. From early on, he has this need to definitely, be at the table with the big boys, right? And to be seen as this, because again, he's coming out of a background, no one trusts him, no one believes him. But as things develop, he sees the need of, man, I'm the worst. And yet God's redeemed me and he's used me because I am the worst person in the world, and that's the message of grace, that God gives us all that grace, and sometimes it is the people that have messed up the most that have the greatest understanding of that, okay? So that's very important. Jesus reverses again in this parable the good and the bad, and he speaks of true humility in prayer. And here's what I'd like to get at a little bit here, because I think we have a misnomer about prayer. And let's face it, we all do this, okay? We all do this when it comes to our prayer life, and I don't care who you are or what you say, but I mean, any Christian at any time has done this, okay? So we look at prayer as a vehicle to get God to do our bidding. Now, this is not to say that we should not pray sincerely for healing or for the healing of our loved ones or healing in our own life, or that we should come to God with sincere hearts asking for various things. Intercessory prayer, prayer that is asking God to intercede on the behalf of others. All of that is good and right. But Jesus, time and again, through all of his parables and through his other teachings, seems to be driving a little bit more in the arena, not that it's the object of our prayer that is whether that's fulfilled in the way we want or not, but rather the purpose of prayer is to develop a closer relationship with God, to grow in our life of faith, to have God show us what his will is for our life. So we go back to this tax collector, we go back to this Pharisee, and here you have someone who's so full of himself that he not only is showing off in his prayer life to show how holy he is, but he's saying, thank God I'm not like all this other riffraff, right? Versus the one who comes to me and says, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Just have mercy upon me, because I am not only a sinner, I am the sinner. I am the worst of all. And so if we believe what we say, if we believe what we read, if we look at this, then we understand within that context what he's driving at. So again, it's not that we should not pray for what we desire, or that we should not pray for specific outcomes, but always with the caveat. And if we have a hard time believing that, then let's go back to the words of Jesus himself and the prayer he taught us, which is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Okay? And so you run into these conundrums in life, and I've run into them as a pastor, and I'm sure you have too. And sometimes we have this simplistic view of prayer, and so there's one Christian who's praying for a family member to recover from a serious illness. And that happens, and that person recovers, and they say, my prayers were answered. You have another Christian who's praying also for the same thing, and that person doesn't recover, and they die. And so it's not that God heard the prayers of the person who was healed and did not hear the prayers of the other person, but we have to say, sometimes when we even can't completely understand that God hears those prayers in different ways. I've always said this, and it only came across over many years of experience, that even death is healing. When we die, or when our loved ones die, God has granted us healing, but maybe it's not healing in the way we desired. He's granted us the ultimate healing, and for our loved ones. Or you have the issues of tragedies, accidents, other things that happen in life that are no rhyme or reason. Oh, how could that have happened to that person? Because they were such a good person. And here you have the bad person who's running around and, life's great and nothing bad ever happens to them. But when we really drill down on this parable, I think what he's saying here is, in terms of our prayer life, is it's not the specific outcome. It's, again, the concept of God be merciful to me, a sinner. God be in my life and help me to develop that relationship with you, so that the purpose of our lives in grace with Jesus Christ is that we would become closer and closer to him. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, and there may be some specific questions that we have. Any specific questions coming out of this before we move on into the next phase here? Any specific questions in terms of Pharisees, tax collectors? Yes?
This isn't related to that, but at the end of any sporting event, usually the winner will be, member of the team will be saying, God was with us, God gave me the strength to do well, and all that. I always wonder, what is the people on the team that lost?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. He's saying, after sports games, you often hear people say, well, God was with us, and then what are the people who lost the game? My response to that is, as most of you know, I am an avid sports fan, but as much of an avid sports fan as I am, I think God has much more to do than be concerned about who wins and loses athletic competitions. So I think there's probably a little more on his plate in terms of what's going on in the world than that. But that does kind of get to the heart of it, and that's why I've always loved athletes who have said, we just pray that no one gets injured. We just pray we have a good competition. We just pray for that. And so, again, that gets into the winners and losers. Because, if you think about it here, Jesus has reversed the standards of who the winners and losers are. Not only in this parable, but in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so we always want to think that is defined in a certain way, but the reality is it is not. So it's a great point. Others? Any other questions? Yes.
What about prayer that's not just interdenominational, but with people who don't believe in the same time? I always struggle with it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that that's a great question. So you're talking about prayer with people of other religions is what you're saying? Yeah. So I go back to, and that is a great question, but I go back to this. To me, in our relationship with non-believers or people of other religions, when it comes to the issue of evangelism and introducing Jesus Christ to them, the only way that that can happen is that we first have to develop some sort of relationship with them. And maybe we don't agree with that, but let's look at Jesus himself. Who did Jesus spend his time with? He didn't spend his time hanging out in the temple all day. He didn't spend his time with the so-called religious people of his day. He spent his time with the outcasts, with the sinners, with the tax collectors, with the prostitutes, and with others. And I think that's a great message for us today, because when we bemoan what's going on in the world or what's going on in our nation and lack of faith or lack of religion or, Christianity declining or whatever it may be, I think it's even more imperative that we then take the time to move outside of the Christian bubble to have those conversations. So I think until you can develop a relationship with someone, you can't really know what the best answer is for that. Because obviously if we come barging into someone who's a person of another faith, hey, I want to have a prayer with you, but maybe you get to know them a little bit and then say, hey, I'd like to have a prayer with you if you're comfortable with that or whatever the case may be. Or even just our intercessory prayer for people of no faith at all or people of other faiths that they might come to know Jesus. I think that's very important. What I do think is important is in that viewpoint and perspective they have of us. I think we're all aware in today's world that there's disenchantment with many Christians who take a more judgmental attitude or a self-righteous or pharisaical attitude, and then that does turn people off. Because if we're walking in like this Pharisee saying, oh, as Christians, we have our act together and we never have any problems and we never have any issues and we have all the answers, probably going to be a turnoff to someone who's not a person of faith. So it's a little long-winded answer to your question, but great question. Any others in terms of that, prayer or faith? Okay, so I want to take a moment to just sum up this parable when we look at this. How do we apply this to our life? So I think the first thing to see is this. And we're going to really see this next week in the parable of the soils. Here's what we want to do. We all want to place ourselves in this parable as being the tax collector and not the Pharisee, right? We all want to be seen as the person who is merciful. What I'd like to suggest is, because we are sinners, sin with a capital S, that fractured relationship, on any given day, we are maybe a little of both, okay? Because on any given day, we may act or treat others a little bit more like that Pharisee, or thank God I'm not like that person. And on any given day, we may try to do acts of kindness, acts of mercy to others. And that's okay, because I think we're really going to see this clearly next week as we again want to define many times this in terms of it's a very static black and white thing. But if we go back and look at the time of Jesus and know that things were in flux then we also understand that. And part of that is understanding ourselves, knowing ourselves, being able to understand that. And that's not, on the one hand, one extreme, beating ourselves up for being bad people, nor is it on the other extreme being the Pharisee who thinks they have their act together, but it's recognizing that humility that we're in the middle of both. And that's what I've gotten out of this parable. And if you haven't, that's great. I've just wasted 60 minutes of your time, but that you'll never get back. But the reality is, from my perspective, I think these are some of the things that are trying to be raised in this parable. So thank you for that. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them afterwards. And let's close in a prayer. Lord, we are so grateful for the opportunity for prayer and that we do have that relationship with you, and you've given us the gift of prayer that we can have that continuing relationship with you. Help us as we move forward to really look at this parable and take it to heart, to understand there's many times that we do act or want to act more like the Pharisee than we do the tax collector. Help us all to understand the importance to depend upon you, to have that humility, and to recognize our own sinfulness. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Remember for next week, parable of the soils, and we will see you then.